all discovered by one farmer's desperate final attempt to save his family's land. The buried wagon that would prove the war's greatest mystery was hidden in plain sight. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the H-Mill. Comments below. And if this story grips you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we've got something even more incredible waiting for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the withered corn stalks as Jake Rodriguez trudged through the 180 acres of what had once been Nebraska's most productive farmland. At 45, he'd never imagined he'd be the one to lose the family farm that had been in the Rodriguez name since 1889, but here he was, staring at a foreclosure notice that gave him exactly 96 hours to produce $78,000 in back payments. Or watch for generations of family legacy disappear forever. The drought of the past 2 years had devastated corn prices across Lancaster County. Jake's farm had been hit harder than most. What should have been golden fields ready for harvest were instead acres of brittle, worthless stalks that barely covered the cost of seed. The bank had been patient, more patient than Jake had expected, but their patience had officially run out. Jake stopped walking and pulled the crumpled foreclosure notice from his jacket pocket, reading it for the 100th time that morning. The legal language was cold and impersonal, reducing 4 generations of family history to a series of missed payments and defaulted loans. First National Bank of Lincoln. Principal amount, $234,000. Total amount due, including interest and penalties, $78,000. Final notice. The irony wasn't lost on him. His great-great-grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, had paid cash for this land in 1889, $800. In gold coins earned from 3 years of backbreaking work on the railroad, Miguel had arrived in Nebraska territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build something lasting for his family. Now, 134 years later, Jake was about to lose everything Miguel had built. "Y'all really think clearing this field is going to make a difference?" called out Maria Santos, Jake's neighbor and the only person still willing to help him with the backbreaking work of preparing the soil for one last desperate planting season. She wiped sweat from her forehead as she surveyed the endless rows of dead corn that needed to be cleared before any new crop could be planted. Jake leaned on his shovel, looking across the field that stretched toward the horizon. The cornfield covered nearly 60 acres of what had once been the farm's most productive section. His father, Roberto, had always said this particular field was special, that the soil here was different somehow, richer and more fertile than the rest of the property. But even this special soil hadn't been enough to overcome 2 consecutive years of drought. "It's the only chance I've got, Maria," Jake replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion and desperation. "The Agricultural Extension Office says if I can get winter wheat in the ground by next week, I might be able to get an emergency loan extension. Something about soil conservation grants and sustainable farming practices." It was a long shot, and they both knew it. Rodriguez Farm had been struggling for years. Ever since the consolidation of agricultural land in the area had made small family farms economically unviable. Corporate agricultural operations had moved into Lancaster County, buying up failing farms and combining them into massive industrial operations. The economics of scale meant that small farmers like Jake couldn't compete on corn prices, equipment costs, or operating efficiency. Jake's father had died 5 years ago, leaving behind equipment debt and a property tax burden that seemed to grow larger every year. Roberto Rodriguez had been a proud man, stubborn in the way that only third-generation farmers could be. He'd refused to sell to the corporate buyers, even when the offers were generous. He died believing that the land would somehow provide for the family the way it always had. The county assessor says this land is worth more as residential development anyway, Maria said, not unkindly. "Those developers from Lincoln have been circling like vultures for months. Maybe it's time to consider their offer." Jake shook his head firmly, the same way his father had when faced with similar suggestions. "Dad made me promise I'd never sell to developers. This land has been farmed by my family since my great-great-grandfather Miguel came here from Mexico. In 1889, 4 generations of Rodriguez men have worked this soil, bled for it, died for it." He gestured toward the original farmhouse that sat about a quarter-mile away, its weathered wood siding and metal roof telling the story of over a century of Nebraska weather. Miguel had built that house with his own hands using lumber he'd hauled from the railroad depot in Lincoln. Every room had been added as the family grew, creating a rambling structure that housed the memories of 4 generations. Miguel was 17 when he arrived in Nebraska, Jake continued. The family stories flowing automatically after years of hearing them at Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. He'd walked from Texas following the railroad construction crews. North worked for 3 years laying track, saving every penny, sending money home to his family in Mexico. Maria had heard these stories before, but she understood their importance to Jake. Family history was sometimes all that kept struggling farmers going when the economics of agriculture turned against them. When Miguel finally had enough money to buy land, he chose this spot specifically, Jake said, pointing toward the section of Cornfield where they'd been working. According to family legend, he said the land spoke to him, that there was something special about this particular section of Nebraska prairie. He pulled out his phone and showed Maria the foreclosure notice he'd received that morning. The harsh reality of their situation stark against the family mythology. Lancaster County agricultural property, 180 acres, historic homestead, established. 1,889. Original deed from Nebraska Territory. $78,000 minimum payment required. Property to be auctioned as is, if payment not received by Friday, 5 p.m. The legal description was brutally efficient in its reduction of a century of family history to mere property lines and tax assessments. Section 14, Township 9 North, Range 7 East. Improved with single-family dwelling. Circa 1889, barn, machinery shed, and various outbuildings. Zoned agricultural with residential development potential. I can't be the one to lose it, Jake said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of generations of responsibility. I can't be the generation that breaks the chain. Maria understood the burden he carried better than most people could. Her own family had lost their farm 3 counties over, victims of the same economic pressures that were squeezing small agricultural operations across Nebraska. Corporate agriculture and climate change had created a perfect storm that was destroying the way of life that had sustained rural communities for over a century. Jake, you've done everything you could, she said gently. The drought, the market, prices, the equipment costs, none of that was your fault? You can't control the weather or commodity markets? Tell that to my dad's memory, Jake replied, gesturing toward the small family cemetery at the edge of the property where 4 generations of Rodriguez farmers were buried. The cemetery was surrounded by a low stone wall that Miguel had built, himself, marking it as sacred ground that would never be plowed or planted. For simple headstones marked the graves of Miguel Rodriguez, 1851 to 1923. His son, Carlos Rodriguez, 1881 to 1954. Jake's grandfather, Juan Rodriguez, 1915 to 1987. And his father, Roberto Rodriguez, 1943 to 2018. Each had lived his entire adult life on this land. Each had passed it on to the next generation in better condition than he'd received it. Tell that to Miguel, who cleared this land with nothing but hope and hard work. Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. He broke prairie sod with a single-blade plow, pulled by a mule. Built the farmhouse board by board, the barn stone by stone. He turned raw prairie into productive farmland through sheer determination. The weight of that legacy pressed down on Jake's shoulders every morning when he walked through the farmyard where his great-great-grandfather had once milked cows by hand and his grandfather had repaired equipment by lamplight. The modern challenges of farming, fluctuating commodity prices, equipment financing, crop insurance, environmental regulations would have been foreign to Miguel. But the fundamental challenge remained the same, making the land produce enough to sustain a family. They worked in silence for the next hour, using shovels and a rented brush cutter to clear the dead corn stalks from a 10-acre section that Jake hoped to plant with winter wheat. The work was exhausting, made worse by the knowledge that it probably wouldn't be enough to save the farm. Winter wheat prices were depressed, and even a good yield wouldn't generate enough cash flow to catch up on 5 years of accumulated debt. The corn stalks were brittle and dry, snapping easily as they cut them down and raked them into piles for burning. In a good year, these same stalks would have been green and full of moisture, heavy with ears of corn that would have filled grain. Benzin provided a year's income. This year they were nothing but agricultural waste, evidence of nature's indifference to human plans and dreams. "Jake, come look at this," Maria called from about 50 yards away, where she'd been working to remove a particularly stubborn section of stalks. "The ground feels different here, like there's something underneath." Jake walked over to where Maria was standing, noticing immediately that the soil in this area was slightly raised, forming a subtle ridge that ran for about 20 feet in a straight line. It was the kind of anomaly that might go unnoticed unless you were looking for it, but once you saw it, it was clearly artificial. "That's weird," he said, kneeling to examine the soil more closely. "This looks like it was disturbed and then covered over, but it's been like this for as long as I can remember." The raised area was subtle but definite, running roughly east to west across the field. The soil was a slightly different color than the surrounding earth, darker and more compacted. Jake had farmed this field for 20 years, since taking over operations from his father, but he'd never noticed this particular anomaly. "My dad always said there were old buffalo wallows scattered across this section," Jake said, trying to rationalize what they were seeing. Places where buffalo herds used to gather and roll in the dirt. Maybe that's what this is. But even as he said it, Jake knew that didn't make sense. Buffalo wallows were circular depressions, not straight lines. And this disturbance was clearly man-made. Too regular and intentional to be natural, Maria scraped away some of the topsoil with her shovel, revealing earth that was definitely different from the surrounding field. "Jake, this soil has been moved. Recently, I mean within the last 100 years or so. Look at the color difference." She was right. The soil beneath the surface was lighter in color and had a different texture than the native Nebraska earth around. It looked like filled dirt soil that had been brought from somewhere else and used to cover something. Jake began digging more systematically, his curiosity overriding his exhaustion. The physical work of clearing corn stalks had been mind-numbing, but this was different. This was a puzzle, a mystery that connected to the land his family had worked for over a century. About 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid, something that definitely wasn't a rock or a tree root. The sound was different, metallic, almost like hitting wood or metal rather than stone. "There's something down here," he said, excitement creeping into his voice for the first time in months. "Something big." As they dug deeper, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever was buried, the outline of what appeared to be a wooden structure began to emerge from the Nebraska soil. The wood was dark with age, but remarkably well preserved, suggesting it had been buried deliberately and carefully. "Maria, this looks like part of a wagon, an old wagon." The implications sent a chill through both of them. The farm had been in Jake's family since 1889, but the land itself had a much longer history. Lancaster County had been part of the frontier during the Civil War era, got a crossroads for travelers heading west, and sometimes a refuge for those trying to disappear from whatever they'd left behind. Nebraska territory had been officially neutral during the Civil War, but that neutrality had been complicated. The territory had strong anti-slavery sentiment, but it had also been a destination for people fleeing the conflict, including some who had supported the Confederacy and needed to disappear after the war ended. "Should we call someone?" asked, suddenly aware that they might be dealing with something historically significant. "The County Historical Society, maybe. Or the state archaeologist." Jake considered this carefully, weighing his options. Call who? The county? The state? "Maria, if this is some kind of archaeological site, they'll shut down the farm for months while they investigate. Can't afford to wait months. I need to plant this field next week or lose everything. The timing couldn't have been worse." Foreclosure looming in less than 4 days, Jake couldn't afford any delays that would prevent him from planting the winter wheat that represented his last hope of obtaining a loan extension. Archaeological investigations could take months or even years, during which time the property would be tied up in legal proceedings. Besides, Jake continued, "This is my land. Whatever's buried here has been here for over a century. It's not going anywhere." They continued digging, working carefully to expose more of the buried structure. What they found was clearly a wagon, or at least the remains of one. The wooden wheels were partially rotted where they'd been in contact with moisture, but the main body was intact, protected by the Nebraska soil and what appeared to be a carefully constructed burial. The wagon was larger than Jake had expected, built for heavy hauling rather than passenger transport. The wood was oak, expensive and durable, suggesting this hadn't been a poor man's vehicle. Someone had invested significant money in this particular wagon and then buried it with enough care to preserve it for over a century. "Jake," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." She was pointing to markings carved into the side of the wagon, symbols and letters that were clearly deliberate rather than accidental damage. Even through the dirt and age, Jake could make out what appeared to be CSA carved into the wood, along with numbers that might have been a date: 1865, Confederate States of America. The discovery sent a shock through both of them. What was a Confederate wagon doing buried in Nebraska, hundreds of miles from any Civil War battlefield? The Civil War had ended in 1865, the same year that appeared to be carved into the wagon's side. But why would Confederate equipment end up buried in what was then Nebraska territory? "This doesn't make sense," Jake said, running his fingers over the carved letters. Nebraska was Union territory during the Civil War. There were never any Confederate military operations here. But even as he said it, Jake remembered stories his grandfather had told about the period after the Civil War, when Nebraska territory had been a destination for people trying to start new lives away from the devastation of the South. Some had been former slaves seeking freedom and opportunity. Others had been Confederate sympathizers, looking to escape the consequences of their wartime activities. "Maybe it belonged to Confederate refugees," Maria suggested. "It's people who came west after the war ended." "But why bury it?" Jake asked. "If you're starting a new life, why bury a perfectly good wagon?" The question hung in the air as they continued to clear soil from around the buried vehicle. The more they exposed, the more mysterious it became. The wagon appeared to have been deliberately buried in a prepared pit, with the burial site carefully disguised to look like natural terrain. "We need to see what's inside," Jake said, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The wagon bed was covered with what appeared to be a canvas tarp, also remarkably well preserved by the burial conditions. The tarp was secured with rope that had partially rotted away, but enough remained to suggest it had been carefully tied down to protect whatever was inside. As they worked to clear more soil from around the wagon, Jake couldn't help but wonder what his great-great-grandfather Miguel might have known about this burial. The timeline was intriguing. Miguel had arrived in Nebraska in 1886 and purchased this land in 1889, just 24 years after the apparent burial date carved into the wagon. Had Miguel found the wagon when he first cleared this land for farming? Had he deliberately chosen to farm around it, keeping its secret safe for over a century? Or had the burial site been so well concealed that even Miguel had never known about it? Jake thought about the family stories, the tales passed down through for generations of Rodriguez farmers. Miguel had always said the land was special, that there was something about this particular section of Nebraska prairie that called to him. Jake had assumed this was just immigrant romanticism, the tendency to mythologize the harsh realities of frontier life. But what if Miguel had known something he'd never shared with his descendants? What if the land's special quality had been related to secrets buried beneath its surface? The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden was about to reveal secrets that would change everything. Jake thought he knew about his family's land, and with foreclosure just 4 days away, whatever was hidden in that buried Confederate wagon might be his only hope of saving for generations of family legacy. "Are you ready for this?" Maria asked as they prepared to carefully lift the canvas tarp that covered the wagon's contents. Jake thought about his promise to his father, about the weight of 4 generations of Rodriguez farmers, about the foreclosure notice in his pocket that would make him the first generation to lose the family land. He thought about Miguel's journey from Mexico, about the gold coins that had purchased this Nebraska prairie, about the sweat and blood that had transformed raw frontier into productive farmland. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Whatever's down there, It's been waiting for us to find it." As Jake reached for the canvas tarp, he couldn't have imagined that he was about to uncover not just a piece of forgotten Civil War history, but evidence of one of the most enduring mysteries of American wartime, the fate of the Confederate treasury that had disappeared in the chaos of the war's final days. The failed corn harvest that had brought him to the brink of financial ruin was about to become the catalyst for a discovery that would transform his understanding of both his family's land and American history itself. And with foreclosure looming, in just 96 hours, time was running out to determine whether this buried secret would be his salvation or simply another burden too dangerous to bear. Jake's hands trembled as he carefully lifted the corner of the rotted canvas tarp that covered the wagon's contents. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the cornfield, creating long shadows that made the excavation site feel increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. What they were about to discover would either be the answer to his prayers or the beginning of complications he couldn't afford with foreclosure looming in just 92 hours. "Go slow," Maria whispered, her voice tight with anticipation. "If there's anything fragile in there, we don't want to damage it." The canvas came away in pieces, disintegrating at Jake's touch after more than a century underground. But what it had protected took both of their breaths away. The wagon bed was filled with wooden crates, each one carefully constructed and sealed with what appeared to be tar or wax to protect against moisture. The preservation was remarkable. Whatever was inside these crates had been protected with the same care and attention that had preserved the wagon itself. "There must be 20 crates in here," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe more." Each crate was roughly the size of a shoebox, built from heavy oak and bound with metal straps that had developed a green patina over the decades. But it was the markings on the crates that made Jake's heart race. Burned into the wood of each container were the letters CSA and what appeared to be serial numbers, along with symbols that Jake didn't recognize but that looked official. Military. "Jake, these look like military supply crates," Maria observed, running her fingers over the burned markings. "But why would Confederate military supplies be buried in Nebraska?" The question hung in the air as Jake carefully lifted one of the smaller crates from the wagon bed. It was heavier than he'd expected, dense in a way that suggested its contents were metal rather than documents or clothing. When he shook it gently, there was no rattle or shifting. Whatever was inside was packed tightly. "Should we open one?" he asked, looking at Maria for confirmation. "We've come this far," she replied. "And Jake, if this is what I think it might be, it could solve all your problems." The metal straps on the first crate had corroded enough that Jake was able to work them loose with his fingers. The lid was sealed with hardened wax, but a few minutes of careful work with his pocket knife allowed him to pry it open. What they found inside made both of them gasp. Gold coins, dozens of them, packed in rows and cushioned with what appeared to be cotton batting. Each coin caught the afternoon light, gleaming as if they had been minted yesterday rather than over 150 years ago. Jake picked up one of the coins with shaking hands, feeling the weight of real gold and examining the markings that clearly identified it as Confederate currency. "Maria," Jake breathed, "do you realize what this is?" The coin in his hand bore the unmistakable markings of Confederate gold. The double eagle design that had been minted in limited quantities during the Civil War. But these weren't just any Confederate coins. Jake had seen enough history documentaries to recognize what he was holding. These were from the Confederate treasury, the gold reserves that had mysteriously disappeared in the final days of the Civil War. "This is impossible," Maria said, her voice filled with awe. "The Confederate gold has been one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Treasure hunters have been looking for it for over 150 years. Jake carefully returned the coin to its position in the crate and closed the lid, his mind reeling with the implications. If this wagon contained even a portion of the lost Confederate treasury, the value would be astronomical, not just in terms of the gold content, but as historical artifacts that could rewrite the understanding of the Civil War's final days. "We need to see how many of these crates contain gold," he said, reaching for another container. The second crate was identical to the first rows of gold coins, perfectly preserved and bearing the same Confederate markings. The third crate was larger and contained what appeared to be gold bars, each one stamped with official Confederate Treasury seals. "Jake, there's enough gold in just these 3 crates to pay off your farm debt 10 times over," Maria said, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. But even as the financial implications sank in, Jake found himself thinking about the historical mystery they'd uncovered. How had Confederate Treasury gold ended up buried in Nebraska? Who had transported it here, and why had they chosen to bury it rather than use it? The timeline was puzzling. The date carved into the wagon suggested 1865, the final year of the Civil War. By 1865, Confederacy was collapsing, its government fleeing Richmond as Union forces closed in. The Confederate Treasury had been evacuated from Richmond in April 1865, just days before the capital fell, but its ultimate fate had remained a mystery. "Maria, what do you know about the end of the Civil War?" Jake asked, as they continued examining the crates. "I mean, what happened to the Confederate government after Richmond fell?" Maria had been a history teacher before budget cuts eliminated her position, and she drew on that knowledge now. The Confederate government and treasury were evacuated from Richmond in early April 1865. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet fled south, trying to reach Texas or Mexico where they could continue the fight or escape to Europe, but they never made it, right? Davis was captured in Georgia in May 1865, but the treasury, that was always a mystery. There were reports that it had been divided up among various Confederate officials, or hidden in different locations, or even shipped overseas. No one ever found definitive proof of what happened to it. Jake looked at the wagon full of gold. Crates understanding now that they had stumbled onto one of the greatest treasure discoveries in American history. What if some of the Confederate treasury was sent west instead of south? What if there was a plan to hide it in the territories where Union forces were less active? The theory made sense. Nebraska Territory in 1865 had been sparsely populated and poorly policed. A small group of Confederate operatives could have traveled here without attracting attention, especially if they posed as ordinary westward migrants. But who would have been responsible for something like this? Maria asked. Jake thought about the careful construction of the burial site, the professional way the wagon had been preserved, the systematic packing of the gold crates. This wasn't done by amateurs. Whoever buried this treasure knew what they were doing. They spent the next 2 hours carefully examining the contents of the wagon. In total, they counted 26 crates containing gold coins, 6 containing gold bars, and 2 containing what appeared to be official documents wrapped in oiled cloth. The documents were in such fragile condition that Jake didn't dare try to examine them in the field. But their presence suggested that the treasure came with detailed records of its origin and purpose. "Jake, we need to calculate the value of what we're looking at," Maria said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the excitement of discovery. They did rough math based on the contents of the crates they'd opened. If each coin-filled crate contained the same amount as the first one they'd examined, and if the gold bars were standard Confederate treasury weights, they were looking at several $1 million worth of gold even at current market prices, not accounting for the historical value. "This changes everything," Jake said, looking around the cornfield that had seemed like such a burden just hours ago. "Maria, this is enough money to save the farm, pay off all the debts, and set up my family for generations." But even as he said it, Jake realized that finding the treasure was only the beginning of his problems. Who could he trust with this discovery? What were the legal implications of finding Confederate gold on his own property? And perhaps most importantly, how could he convert this discovery into the cash he needed to prevent foreclosure in less than 4 days? "Can't tell anyone about this," Maria said, reading his thoughts. "Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we involve lawyers or historians or treasure experts." Jake nodded, understanding the wisdom of her caution. "But Maria, I can't just sit on this while the bank forecloses on Friday. This treasure could save everything, but only if I can figure out how to use it." The practical challenges were overwhelming. Banks didn't accept Confederate gold as collateral. Converting historical artifacts to cash would require authentication, legal documentation, and probably months of negotiation with collectors or museums. "There has to be someone we can trust," Jake said. "Someone who understands both the historical value and the practical challenges." Maria pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. I know someone who might help. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins at the University of Nebraska. She's a Civil War historian, and she's done work on Confederate treasury mysteries. If anyone would know how to handle this discovery responsibly, it would be her. Can we trust her? Liz is solid. She cares more about historical truth than personal gain. She understands the financial pressures that ordinary people face. Jake looked at the treasure wagon, then at the foreclosure notice in his pocket, then at the farm buildings that represented 4 generations of family legacy. Call her, but Maria, make it clear that we need her discretion. If word of this discovery gets out before we're ready, it could create more problems than it solves. As Maria made the call, Jake began the careful process of resealing the crates and covering the wagon bed with a tarp from his truck. Whatever they did next, the treasure needed to be protected from weather and discovery until they could develop a proper plan. Dr. Hawkins can meet us tonight, Maria reported after ending her call. But Jake. She wants to bring someone else, a specialist in Confederate treasury research, who happens to be visiting the university this week. Who? Dr. Marcus Thompson from the National Archives. Apparently he's one of the leading experts on Confederate financial operations during the final months of the war. The involvement of a National Archives specialist made Jake nervous. Maria, what if he wants to claim this treasure for the federal government? What if there are laws about finding Confederate artifacts? Dr. Hawkins says he's not that kind. A bureaucrat. He's a historian first, focused on solving historical mysteries rather than seizing artifacts for the government. Jake weighed his options. The foreclosure deadline was approaching rapidly, and he needed expert advice to convert his discovery into practical salvation for the farm. But involving outsiders also increased the risk that the treasure would be taken out of his control. Set up the meeting, he decided, but here on the farm, not at the university. I want home field advantage for this conversation. As they worked to conceal the excavation site, Jake found his mind racing with questions about the family history he thought he knew. Had his great-great-grandfather Miguel known about the buried treasure when he purchased this land in 1889? The timing was suspicious. Miguel had arrived in Nebraska in 1886, just 21 years after the apparent burial date. Maria, what if my family has been guarding this secret for over a century? Jake asked, as they scattered loose corn stalks over the refilled excavation. What if Miguel knew exactly what he was buying when he chose this particular section of Nebraska prairie? The theory was fascinating but troubling. If Miguel had known about the treasure, why hadn't he used it to secure the family's financial future? Why had he allowed his descendants to struggle with agricultural economics when there were millions of dollars in gold buried in their own cornfield? Maybe he was protecting it, Maria suggested. Maybe he understood that some discoveries are too dangerous to use. Or maybe he was waiting for the right time, Jake countered. Maybe he thought that someday his descendants would need this treasure more than he did. As they finished concealing the site, Jake realized that his perspective on the family farm had been completely transformed in the space of a single afternoon. The land that had seemed like a burden, a failing agricultural operation that was about to destroy 4 generations of family legacy, was actually the guardian of one of America's greatest historical treasures. But treasure that couldn't be used was just expensive dirt, and with foreclosure approaching in less than 90 hours, Jake needed to find a way to transform his discovery into the salvation of everything his family had built. Jake, Maria said, as they walked back toward the farmhouse, there's something else we need to consider. If this treasure is as significant as we think it is, there might be other people who know about it. People who have been searching for it for generations. The thought sent a chill through Jake. You mean treasure hunters? Mean people who might have family connections to the original burial? Confederate descendants? Treasure hunting organizations? Maybe even government agencies that have been tracking Confederate treasury mysteries for decades. Jake looked back at the cornfield that now held secrets worth millions of dollars. So we might not be the only ones interested in this discovery. We might not even be the first ones to find it, Maria replied. But we might be the first ones to find it who actually own the land it's buried on. As they reached the farmhouse, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a struggling farmer trying to save his family's land. He was the guardian of a treasure that could rewrite Civil War history, the keeper of secrets that powerful people might kill to possess. The failing farm that had seemed like such a burden was revealed to be something far more complex and dangerous. And Jake Rodriguez, who had inherited a legacy of agricultural struggle, was about to discover that some inheritances come with responsibilities that extend far beyond paying taxes and planting crops. Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Thompson will be here? At 8 o'clock, Maria said, checking her phone for the time. That gives us 3 hours to prepare for what might be the most important conversation of your life. Jake looked at the farmhouse where 4 generations of his family had lived and died, at the fields where they had planted their hopes, season after season, at the family cemetery where their dreams were buried alongside their bones. What if it's a curse that's been waiting over a century to destroy my family? Then we'll face that curse together, she replied. But Jake, curses don't pay off bank loans. And right now, you need a miracle more than you need to worry about. Ancient history. As the sun began to set over the Nebraska prairie, Jake prepared to meet the historians who would help him understand what he had discovered and what it might cost him to claim it. The treasure that could save his farm might also destroy everything he thought he knew about his family, his land, and his place in the long, complicated history of American conflict. The Confederate gold that had been hidden in his cornfield for over 150 years was about to reveal secrets that some people had been protecting, and others had been seeking for generations. And Jake Rodriguez, reluctant guardian of dangerous knowledge, was about to learn that some discoveries change not just your circumstances, but your entire understanding of who you are and what you owe to the past. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins arrived at the Rodriguez farm precisely at 8 o'clock, her headlights cutting through the Nebraska darkness as she pulled into the gravel driveway. Jake watched from the farmhouse window as she parked her sedan next to a black SUV that had arrived just minutes earlier, presumably Dr. Thompson from the National Archives. The sight of the government vehicle made Jake's stomach tighten with anxiety about what he was about to reveal. "They're here," he called to Maria, who was in the kitchen making coffee with hands that shook slightly from the day's excitement and stress. "Are you sure we can trust them?" "Sure as I can be about anything right now," Maria replied, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Liz has always been straight with me, and she wouldn't bring someone she didn't trust." Jake opened the front door before the historians could knock, wanting to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. Dr. Hawkins was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of intense, intelligent eyes that Jake associated with serious academics. Dr. Thompson was younger, perhaps 40, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time in archives than in social situations. "Jake, thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Dr. Hawkins said, extending her hand. Maria was rather mysterious on the phone, but she indicated you might have found something significant. Dr. Thompson, the National Archives specialist, introduced himself, his handshake firm and his manner professional, but not intimidating. "I understand you've made a discovery related to Civil War history." Jake led them into the farmhouse living room, where the walls were covered with 4 generations of Rodriguez family photographs. The historians took seats on the old couch that had been in the family since Jake's grandfather's time, while Maria served coffee and Jake tried to organize his thoughts. "Before we begin," Jake said, "I need to understand something. If I show you what we found, what are my legal obligations? What are yours?" Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. "That depends on what you found and where you found it. But I can tell you that the National Archives isn't in the business of seizing private property from landowners. Our interest is in historical preservation and understanding. What Marcus means, Dr. Hawkins added, is that we're historians first, bureaucrats second. Our goal is to help you understand what you've discovered and explore options that serve both historical preservation and your personal interests. Jake studied their faces, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. What he saw instead was genuine curiosity and professional excitement, the look of people who devoted their lives to solving historical puzzles. "All right," he said finally, "but what I'm about to show you has to remain confidential until we can figure out how to handle it properly." Both historians nodded their agreement, and Jake led them outside into the darkness of the cornfield. He'd prepared for this moment by setting up battery-powered work lights around the excavation site, but he'd kept them off until now to avoid attracting attention from neighboring farms. "It's about 100 yards into the field," Jake explained, as they walked along the rows of cleared corn stalks. "Maria and I were preparing this section for winter wheat when we noticed an anomaly in the soil. When they reached the site, Jake switched on the work lights, illuminating the partially re-excavated wagon that gleamed with the dull patina of century-old wood and metal. Both historians stopped dead in their tracks, their professional composure giving way to obvious amazement. "My God," Dr. Hawkins breathed. "Jake, this is extraordinary. The preservation is remarkable." Dr. Thompson was already kneeling beside the wagon, examining the carved markings with the careful attention of someone who had spent years studying Civil War artifacts. CSA, 1865. The construction is consistent with Confederate military wagons from the final year of the war. "But that's just the beginning," Jake said, his voice tight with excitement and nervousness. "You need to see what's inside." He carefully lifted the tarp covering the wagon bed, revealing the rows of sealed crates that had been the source of his amazement earlier that day. The historian's reactions were even more dramatic than Jake had expected. "Confederate treasury crates?" Dr. Thompson whispered, his voice filled with professional awe. "I've seen photographs of similar containers in archives, but never originals. Never intact specimens." Dr. Hawkins was examining the burned markings on the crate lids with the intensity of someone who understood their historical significance. "Jake, do you realize what you may have found? These markings match descriptions of Confederate treasury storage from the final evacuation of Richmond." Jake nodded, his heart racing with the implications. "We opened 3 of the crates. Contained Confederate gold coins and bars, dozens of them." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rustling through the corn stalks around them. Both historians stared at the wagon with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Show us," Dr. Thompson said finally. Jake carefully opened one of the crates he'd examined earlier. Revealing the rows of gold coins gleaming in the artificial light, Dr. Thompson and Dr. Hawkins leaned closer, their professional training evident in the way they examined the coins without touching them. "These are authentic Confederate double eagles," Dr. Thompson confirmed. "Minted in 1864 and 1865, the final gold currency produced by the Confederate treasury before Richmond fell." "But how did they end up in Nebraska?" Dr. Hawkins asked, voicing the question that had been haunting Jake since the discovery. "That's what we're hoping you can help us understand," Maria said. "The timeline suggests the wagon was buried in 1865, but Jake's family didn't purchase this land until 1889. Dr. Thompson was studying the wagon construction with renewed interest. The burial was professional, designed for long-term preservation. This wasn't a hasty concealment, it was a planned operation." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Look at the construction of the burial pit," Dr. Thompson explained, pointing to the carefully fitted stones that lined the excavation. "This wagon was buried in a prepared site with drainage considerations and protective measures. Someone intended for this treasure to remain hidden until it could be safely recovered." Dr. Hawkins was examining the documents that Jake had found in the final 2 crates. "These papers might contain the answers we're looking for, but they're too fragile to examine properly in field conditions. We need controlled environment and proper conservation equipment." "What kind of documents?" Jake asked. "Official papers by the look of them. Possibly orders, manifests, or operational records. Documents that would explain how this treasure came to be buried in Nebraska. Jake felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The documents might solve the historical mystery, but they might also reveal information that could complicate his legal claim to the treasure. "Dr. Hawkins, what's your professional opinion about the significance of this discovery?" he asked. The historian was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. "Jake, if this treasure is what it appears to be, you've made one of the most important Civil War discoveries in American history. The fate of the Confederate treasury has been one of the great unsolved mysteries of the war." "But what does that mean for me practically?" Jake pressed. "I need to save my farm, and I need to do it in less than 88 hours. Dr. Thompson understood the urgency in Jake's voice. The immediate practical challenge is authentication and valuation. Even if we can establish the historical significance quickly, converting that into liquid assets will take time. How much time? Months? Potentially? Museums, collectors, and government agencies all move slowly when dealing with discoveries of this magnitude. Jake felt his hopes beginning to crumble. "So this treasure could be worth millions of dollars, but it can't help me save the farm." "Not necessarily," Dr. Hawkins said thoughtfully. "There might be other options. Private collectors, emergency museum acquisitions, or even using the discovery as collateral for a loan extension. What we need," Dr. Thompson added, "is a comprehensive understanding of exactly what you found, a complete inventory, authentication of the most significant pieces, and documentation that would satisfy potential buyers or institutions." Jake looked at the treasure wagon, then at the foreclosure notice in his pocket, then at the historians who represented his best hope of navigating the complex challenges ahead. "How long would that take?" he asked. "If we work through the night and bring in additional experts tomorrow, we could have preliminary authentication within 48 hours, Dr. Hawkins replied. "That might be enough to negotiate with your bank or find emergency financing." "But Jake," Dr. Thompson added, "you need to understand that a discovery of this magnitude will attract attention from multiple parties. Government agencies, academic institutions, treasure hunters, and possibly people with less legitimate interests." "What kind of people?" "People who believe they have claims to Confederate treasure, descendants of Confederate officials, treasure hunting organizations, or groups that have been searching for this specific cache for generations." The warning sent a chill through Jake. "You're saying this discovery could put me in danger?" "I'm saying that Confederate gold has been the subject of treasure hunting legends for over 150 years. Some of those legends have attracted obsessive followers who might not respect legal ownership or peaceful negotiation." Maria stepped closer to Jake, her expression worried. "Maybe we should have left it buried," Jake said firmly. "This treasure has been waiting for over a century. It's not a coincidence that we found it now when we need it most." Dr. Hawkins nodded approvingly. "Jake, I think you're right, but we need to be smart about how we proceed. We need to document everything, establish clear legal ownership, and find buyers or institutions that can move quickly." "What's the first step?" Jake asked. "We need to examine those documents tonight," Dr. Thompson replied. "If they contain operational records or orders, they might explain how the treasure came to be buried here. That information could be crucial for establishing both historical significance and legal ownership." Jake looked around the cornfield that had been transformed from a symbol of his family's failure into the site of one of America's greatest treasure discoveries. The failed corn harvest that had brought him to the brink of financial ruin was about to become the catalyst for a discovery that could change everything. "All right," he said. "Let's see what secrets this treasure has been keeping." They spent the next hour carefully extracting the most fragile documents from the wagon. Using proper conservation techniques that Dr. Hawkins had learned from decades of historical research, the papers were in remarkable condition, protected by the same careful burial that had preserved the gold. "These are operational orders," Dr. Thompson said, examining the first document by the light of a magnifying glass. Dated April 15, 1865. "Instructions for the transport of Confederate treasury assets to safe locations in the Western Territories." April 15th, Dr. Hawkins noted. "That's just days after Richmond fell. This treasure was evacuated as part of the final Confederate government operations. Jake leaned closer to examine the document. Who signed the orders? Colonel James Sterling, Confederate Treasury Guard, Dr. Thompson read. Acting under authority of Treasury Secretary George Trenholm and President Jefferson Davis. The names meant nothing to Jake, but he could see the excitement in the historians' faces. Are these significant people? Colonel Sterling was one of the officers responsible for evacuating the Confederate treasury from Richmond, Dr. Hawkins explained. George Trenholm was the final Confederate Secretary of the Treasury, and Jefferson Davis was, of course, the Confederate president. So this treasure was officially sanctioned by the Confederate government? More than that, Dr. Thompson said, examining additional documents. These orders suggest that the treasure was part of a broader plan to preserve Confederate assets. For future operations, they weren't just hiding gold. They were preparing for the possibility of continuing the war from Western territories. Jake felt his understanding of the discovery shifting again. You're saying this wasn't just treasure, it was part of a military operation? Look at this, Dr. Hawkins said, pointing to another document. These are detailed maps showing routes. From Richmond through Kentucky and Missouri to Nebraska territory. This was a carefully planned operation involving multiple stages and safe houses. And here, Dr. Thompson added, examining a third document, are the names of the officers responsible. For each stage of the operation, Colonel Sterling was responsible for the final stage, the burial and concealment of the treasure.
Ow.
Jake studied the documents with growing amazement. So Colonel Sterling and his men transported this treasure all the way from Richmond to Nebraska. Then buried it here? It's exactly what these documents suggest, Dr. Hawkins confirmed. But there's more. Look at this final document. The paper she indicated was different from the others, less official, more personal. It appeared to be a letter written in a different hand, addressed to future guardians of the Confederate Trust. This is a personal message from Colonel Sterling, Dr. Thompson read aloud. Writes, to those who may discover this cache. Know that it represents the final hope of the Confederate cause. The war may be lost, but the principles for which we fought must not be forgotten. This treasure is entrusted to the land and to those who work it, to be used when the time comes to restore the South to its rightful place in the American nation. The words sent a chill through Jake. He's talking about future Confederate operations. He's talking about people who believed the Civil War wasn't truly over, Dr. Hawkins corrected. Colonel Sterling apparently expected that Confederate sympathizers would eventually recover this treasure and use it to fund some kind of restoration movement. Jake looked around the cornfield with new eyes. So this land was chosen specifically as a hiding place for Confederate treasure. More than that, Dr. Thompson said, examining the final document. According to this letter, Colonel Sterling made arrangements with local contacts to monitor the burial site and ensure its security. He mentions trusted allies among the Western immigrants who would guard the treasure until the time of restoration. Western immigrants, Maria repeated. Jake, your great-great-grandfather Miguel was an immigrant who came west in the 1880s. The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. You're suggesting that Miguel was part of this Confederate network? I'm suggesting that the timing is suspicious. Dr. Hawkins replied carefully. Miguel purchased this land in 1889, just 24 years after the treasure was buried. If there was a network of people monitoring the site, they might have arranged for the land to be purchased by someone they trusted. Jake felt his understanding of his family history crumbling, but Miguel was Mexican, came to Nebraska too. Escape poverty and build a better life. Why would he be involved with Confederate treasure? Money, Dr. Thompson said simply. The Civil War created opportunities for people who were willing to work with whoever paid best. Miguel might have been recruited by Confederate agents who needed reliable allies in the territories. Or, Dr. Hawkins added more gently, Miguel might have discovered the treasure after purchasing the land and made the decision to protect it without fully understanding its implications. Jake tried to process this new information. Everything he thought he knew about his family history was being challenged by documents that suggested his great-great-grandfather might have been involved in Confederate conspiracies. There's one more document, Dr. Thompson said, holding up a final paper. This one appears to be much more recent. Early 1900s, based on the paper and ink. He examined it carefully before reading aloud. The trust remains secure. The guardian understands his responsibility. Treasure will be preserved until the time of restoration. Signed M. Rodriguez, 1905. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind, rustling through the corn stalks. Jake stared at the document that bore his great-great-grandfather's signature. Understanding now that his family's relationship with the Confederate treasure was far more complex than he had imagined. Miguel knew, he said quietly. He knew about the treasure, and he agreed to protect it. It appears that way, Dr. Hawkins confirmed. Your great-great-grandfather was apparently part of a network that preserved this treasure for over a century. Jake looked at the treasure wagon, then at the documents that revealed his family's secret history, then at the foreclosure notice that would end for generations of guardianship in less than 88 hours. So I'm not just the owner of this treasure, he said. I'm its guardian, just like Miguel was. The question is, Dr. Thompson said, what do you want to do with that inheritance? Jake thought about the Confederate gold that had been hidden beneath his cornfield for over 150 years, about the secret his family had kept for 4 generations, about the responsibility that had been passed down without his knowledge or consent. I want to save my farm, he said finally. But I also want to understand what my family has been protecting and why. Then we need to keep working, Dr. Hawkins said. These documents are just the beginning. If we can fully authenticate the treasure and establish its historical significance, we might be able to find a solution that serves both your immediate needs and your family's long-term responsibilities. As they prepared to transport the most significant documents back to the farmhouse for detailed examination, Jake reflected on how completely his understanding of his situation had changed. The failing farm that had seemed like a burden was revealed to be the guardian of one of America's greatest historical treasures. The family legacy that had seemed like a source of shame was revealed to be a sacred trust that had been maintained for generations. But treasure that came with obligations was not the same as treasure that could be freely used. Approaching in less than 88 hours, Jake needed to find a way to honor both his family's secret history and his immediate need to save everything they had built. The Confederate gold that had been waiting beneath his cornfield for over a century was about to test whether he was worthy of the trust that had been placed in him, and whether he could find a way to use his inheritance to preserve, rather than destroy the legacy he had been given. Jake's phone rang at 3:47 a.m., jolting him from the first real sleep he'd managed since discovering the treasure. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something about the late-night timing made him answered despite his exhaustion. Mr. Rodriguez. Came a voice he didn't recognize, cultured, southern, the kind of authority that suggested the speaker was accustomed to being obeyed. Who is this? Jake asked, immediately alert despite the early hour. My name is Colonel William Beauregard, and I represent certain interests that have been monitoring your recent archaeological activities. I believe we need to have a conversation. Jake's blood went cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Rodriguez, please don't insult my intelligence. We know about the wagon. We know about the treasure. And we know about your family's long history as guardians of property that rightfully belongs to the Confederate Memorial Trust. The what? An organization that has been preserving Confederate heritage and assets for over 150 years? Your great-great-grandfather, Miguel, was one of our most trusted guardians, as were your grandfather and father before you. But it seems the current generation of the Rodriguez family has forgotten their obligations. Jake looked around his darkened bedroom, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. What do you want? What we've always wanted, Mr. Rodriguez? The return of Confederate assets to their rightful custodians. Your family has been caretakers, not owners. Dude, the time has come to transfer the treasure to people who understand its true historical significance. And if I refuse? Colonel Beauregard's voice hardened. Then you'll discover that some obligations transcend individual preferences. Your family signed agreements over a century ago. Those agreements are still binding. The line went dead, leaving Jake staring at his phone in the darkness. He immediately called Dr. Hawkins, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. Jake, what's wrong? Someone just called me. Someone who claims to represent something called the Confederate Memorial Trust. They know about the treasure, and they're claiming ownership. There was a pause before Dr. Hawkins responded. Jake, you need to get dressed and get out of the farmhouse now, Maria too. Meet us at the university. Organizations like the Confederate Memorial Trust have been operating in secret for generations. They're not just historical preservation societies, they're networks of people who believe the Civil War never truly ended. If they're contacting you directly, it means they're prepared to take action. Jake was already pulling on his clothes, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What kind of action? The kind that puts your life in danger? Jake, these people have been waiting over 150 years for this treasure. They're not going to let legal ownership or modern laws stand in their way. Jake woke Maria and quickly explained the situation. Within minutes, they were dressed and heading toward Jake's pickup truck, carrying the most important documents from the treasure cache. The farmhouse that had been his family's sanctuary for 4 generations now felt like a trap. Should we call the police? Maria asked as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward Lincoln. And tell them what? That we found Confederate treasure and now mysterious organizations are claiming it? They'll think we're crazy. Maybe we should have left it buried, Maria said quietly. Jake understood her fear, but he also understood that they had passed the point of no return. Maria, if this Confederate Memorial Trust has been monitoring the treasure for 150 years, they would have found it eventually. At least now we know what we're dealing with. They reached the University of Nebraska campus just as the sun was beginning to rise over the prairie. Dr. Hawkins and Dr. Thompson were waiting for them in the parking lot of the history building, along with 2 other people Jake didn't recognize. Jake, Maria, this is Dr. Sarah Running Bear from the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Hawkins said, introducing a Native American woman in her 40s. And this is Agent David Chen from the FBI's art crime team. Presence of an FBI agent sent a chill through Jake. Am I in trouble? You're in danger, Agent Chen replied. The Confederate Memorial Trust and similar organizations have been on our radar for years. They've been involved in everything from artifact theft to domestic terrorism. If they're claiming your treasure, we need to take that very seriously. Dr. Running Bear stepped forward, her expression sympathetic but urgent. Jake, I've been researching Confederate treasure legends for over 20 years. The Confederate Memorial Trust isn't just a historical society, it's a network of white supremacist organizations that use Civil War nostalgia to justify modern racial violence. What does that have to do with my treasure? Everything, Agent Chen replied. These organizations believe that Confederate gold represents more than just money, it represents the resources needed to restore the South to its pre-Civil War social order. They've been searching for caches like yours for generations. Jake looked at the small group of experts who had gathered to help him, understanding now that his discovery had attracted attention from forces far more dangerous than he had imagined. How did they find out about the treasure so quickly? They asked. Someone talked, Dr. Thompson said grimly. Either someone overheard our conversation yesterday, or there's been surveillance on your property for longer than we realized. Surveillance. Agent Chen nodded. The Confederate Memorial Trust has been monitoring potential treasure sites for decades. They probably knew about the anomaly in your cornfield long before you started clearing it. The implications were staggering. So they were waiting for me to find the treasure. They were waiting for someone to find it, Dr. Running Bear corrected. The fact that it was a member of the Rodriguez family was probably considered a bonus, given your family's historical connection to the cache. Jake felt a surge of anger. You're telling me that my family has been manipulated for over a century? That we've been unknowing pawns in some Confederate conspiracy? Not pawns, Dr. Hawkins said gently. Guardians, great-great-grandfather. Miguel chose to protect the treasure rather than use it or turn it over to Confederate agents. That was an act of moral courage, not manipulation. But now these people want to claim it? They want to claim it, and they're prepared to use violence to get it, Agent Chen confirmed. Jake, we need to move quickly. The Confederate Memorial Trust has resources and connections that make them extremely dangerous when they're pursuing something they consider essential to their cause. Dr. Thompson was examining the documents they had brought from the farm. These operational orders prove that the treasure was part of official Confederate government operations. It gives it enormous historical significance, but it also provides legal justification for the Trust's claims. What kind of justification? They'll argue that the treasure was stolen from the Confederate government, that they're the legitimate heirs to Confederate assets, Dr. Running Bear explained. It's legally nonsense, but it's the kind of argument that can tie up ownership. In court for years, Jake looked around the group of experts, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. So what are my options? You have 3 choices, Agent Chen said. First, you can turn the treasure over to the Confederate Memorial Trust and hope they leave you alone. Second, you can fight them in court and risk years of legal battles and potential violence. Third, you can work with federal authorities to ensure the treasure is preserved for legitimate historical research. What does the third option involve? Donating the treasure to a federal institution like the Smithsonian, where it can be studied and displayed while remaining protected from private claims, Dr. Running Bear explained. You'd receive fair market compensation, and the treasure would be preserved for future generations. Jake thought about the foreclosure notice in his pocket, about the 84 hours remaining before he lost his family's farm. How long would that process take? Months, Agent Chen admitted. Federal acquisitions move slowly, even in emergency situations. I don't have months. I have 3.5 days. Dr. Hawkins leaned forward. Jake, there might be another option. If we can establish clear legal ownership and find a private collector willing to purchase the treasure immediately, we could bypass both the Confederate Memorial Trust and the federal bureaucracy. What kind of collector? Someone with the resources to move quickly and the security to protect the treasure from theft, Dr. Thompson replied. There are individuals and institutions that specialize in acquiring historically significant artifacts under urgent circumstances. Agent Chen looked skeptical. That's risky. Private collectors don't always have the same security resources as federal institutions, and if the Confederate Memorial Trust is determined to claim the treasure, they might target any private buyer. But it's the only option that could generate cash quickly enough to save Jake's farm, Maria pointed out. Jake weighed his choices, none of which seemed ideal. Fighting the Confederate Memorial Trust would be dangerous and time-consuming. Donating to the federal government would preserve the treasure, but wouldn't solve his immediate financial crisis. Working with a private collector offered the best chance of saving his farm, but also the greatest risk. I need to see the farm, he said finally. I need to understand what we're dealing with before I make any decisions. Agent Chen frowned. Jake, returning to your property could be dangerous. The Confederate Memorial Trust is monitoring the site. They might try to prevent you from removing the treasure. It's my land. It's my treasure. And I'm not going to be scared away by people who think they can claim ownership based on Civil War fantasies. Dr. Running Bear nodded approvingly. Jake, I think you're right, but you shouldn't go alone. We need to approach this systematically, with proper security and documentation. What do you suggest? We go back to the farm as a team, Dr. Hawkins said. Agent Chen can provide security. Dr. Thompson and I can document everything for legal purposes. And Dr. Running Bear can begin the authentication process that will be necessary regardless of who ultimately acquires the treasure. Jake looked around the group, feeling grateful for their support, but also aware that involving so many people increased the risk of discovery. All right. But we move fast. I want to get a complete inventory of the treasure and then get it to a secure location. What about your family's guardianship obligations? Dr. Thompson asked. The documents suggest that your great-great-grandfather made commitments that extend beyond simple ownership. Jake thought about Miguel's 1905 letter, about the promise to preserve the treasure until the time of restoration. Miguel made those commitments over a century ago, based on information he probably didn't fully understand. I'm not bound by agreements that were made under false pretenses. The Confederate Memorial Trust might not see it that way, Agent Chen warned. Then they'll have to convince me, Jake replied. And I don't think threats and intimidation are going to be very persuasive. As they prepared to return to the farm, Jake's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a local number, his neighbor, Tom Bradley, who lived about a mile down the county road. Jake, where are you? Tom asked, his voice tight with concern. There are people at your farm, strange people, asking questions about you and your family. What kind of people? City people? Expensive cars? professional clothes. They're asking about your financial situation, about the farm's history, about your great-great-grandfather Miguel. Jake's blood ran cold. How many people? At least 6 that I've seen, maybe more. Shh. Jake, they're not just asking questions. They're examining your property like they're planning to buy it. Did they identify themselves? They said they were from a historical preservation organization, something about protecting Confederate heritage sites. Jake looked at Agent Chen, who was following the conversation with growing concern. Tom, I need you to stay away from those people. Don't answer any more questions, and don't let them onto your property. Jake, what's going on? These people seem to know things about your family that I've never heard before. I'll explain later. Right now, I need you to be careful. Jake ended the call and looked around the group of experts who had gathered to help him. They're all ready. At the farm, Confederate Memorial Trust is making their move. Then we need to move faster, Agent Chen said. If they're examining the property, they're probably planning to excavate the treasure site themselves. Dr. Hawkins was already gathering her documentation equipment. Jake, we need to get to that treasure before they do. Once they have physical possession, legal ownership becomes much more complicated. What if they're armed? Maria asked. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, Jake replied. This is my land, my treasure, and my family's legacy. I'm not going to let it be stolen by people who think they can intimidate me into submission. As they prepared to leave the university, Jake reflected on how completely his life had changed in less than 24 hours. The struggling farmer who had been facing foreclosure had become the guardian of one of America's greatest historical treasures, pursued by mysterious organizations and protected by federal agents. Agent Chen, he said, as they walked toward their vehicles. What happens if the Confederate Memorial Trust gets the treasure? Then they'll have the resources to fund activities that the FBI has been trying to stop for decades, Chen replied grimly. Jake, this isn't just about money. It's about preventing Confederate gold from being used to finance modern hate crimes. Jake understood now that his discovery had implications far beyond his personal financial crisis. The treasure that could save his farm could also fund organizations dedicated to reversing the social progress that had been made since the Civil War ended. Then we make sure they don't get it, he said firmly, as they drove back toward the farm through the Nebraska countryside. Jake carried with him the weight of his family's secret history and the responsibility of ensuring that Confederate gold would be used to preserve rather than destroy the progress that had been made since his first agreed to guard the treasure over a century ago. The failing farm that had seemed like a burden was revealed to be the center of a struggle that extended far beyond agricultural economics. And Jake Rodriguez, reluctant guardian of dangerous knowledge, was about to discover that some treasures are worth fighting for. Regardless of the cost, the Confederate Memorial Trust had been waiting over 150 years for this moment. But they had underestimated the determination of a fourth-generation farmer who understood that some legacies are too important to surrender, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. As they approached the farm, Jake could see vehicles parked along the county road and figures moving through his cornfield. The battle for the Confederate gold was about to begin. Jake was determined to ensure that his family's century of guardianship would not end with surrender to people who represented everything his great-great-grandfather had chosen to oppose. The treasure hunt that had begun with a desperate attempt to save a failing farm was about to become a confrontation between competing visions of American history. And Jake Rodriguez was about to discover that some inheritances come with the obligation to fight for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. Jake's heart pounded as they approached his farm from the back road that ran along the eastern edge of his property. Through the trees, he could see at least 8 vehicles parked around his farmhouse, and barn-expensive SUVs and sedans that looked completely out of place in the rural Nebraska landscape. Figures in dark clothing were moving systematically through his cornfield, some carrying metal detectors and excavation equipment. They're not wasting any time, Agent Chen observed, studying the scene through binoculars. This is a professional operation. They know exactly what they're looking for and where to find it. Dr. Running Bear was documenting everything with her camera, her expression grim. Jake, these people have been planning this for a long time. They probably have detailed maps and historical records that we've never seen, which means they might know more about the treasure than we do, Dr. Thompson added, including whether there are other cache sites on your property. Jake felt a chill at the implication. Other sites? The documents we found mentioned multiple stages of the evacuation operation, Dr. Hawkins explained. It's possible that your Cornfield cache was just one of several treasure deposits in the area. Agent Chen lowered his binoculars and looked at Jake. We need to approach this carefully. These people are trespassing on your property, but they're also heavily armed and professionally organized. If we're going to reclaim your treasure, we need to be smart about it. What do you suggest? We wait for backup. I've called for additional agents, and the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department is sending deputies. We'll have enough law enforcement presence to handle this situation safely. Jake looked at his watch. How long will that take? 2 hours, maybe 3. I don't have 3 hours, Jake said, his frustration boiling over. Every minute we wait is another minute they have to dig up my treasure and disappear with it. Maria placed a hand on his arm.
Jake, Agent Chen is right. We can't fight armed professionals with nothing but determination.
But we can't just sit here while they steal everything either, Jake replied. There has to be something we can do. Dr. Running Bear was studying the Confederate Memorial Trust operation through her own binoculars. Jake, I think there might be. Look at how they're working. They're being methodical, systematic. They're not just grabbing the treasure and running. They're documenting everything, taking photographs, treating this like an archaeological excavation. Does that mean? It means they want to claim legal ownership, not just steal the treasure, Agent Chen realized. They're building a case that this cache belongs to them by right of Confederate heritage. Jake felt his anger rising. So they're not just thieves, they're thieves with lawyers, which gives us an opportunity, Dr. Hawkins said thoughtfully. If they're treating this as a legal claim rather than a robbery, they'll want to avoid direct confrontation with law enforcement. They'll want to appear reasonable and professional. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we approach them directly. We go to your farm, assert your legal ownership, and demand that they cease their excavation activities. Agent Chen looked skeptical. That's risky. If they're as dangerous as we think they are, direct confrontation could turn violent. Not if we approach it correctly, Dr. Running Bear said. Jake, you're the legal owner of this property. You have the right to ask trespassers to leave. If they refuse, they're committing crimes that law enforcement can address. Jake considered the options. Waiting for backup might be safer, but it also gave the Confederate Memorial Trust more time to claim and remove the treasure. It was dangerous, but it might be the only way to prevent them from completing their operation. We do it, he decided, but we do it smart. Agent Chen, you stay back and call for backup if things go wrong. The rest of us approach as historians and property owners, not as adversaries. Jake, are you sure about this? Maria asked. I'm sure that I'm not going to let my family's legacy be stolen by people who think they can intimidate me into submission, Jake replied. Gail protected this treasure for over a century. Not going to be the generation that loses it to Confederate fanatics. They drove openly up Jake's driveway, making no attempt to conceal their arrival. The Confederate Memorial Trust operatives noticed them immediately, and Jake could see figures gathering near the farmhouse. A man in an expensive suit, presumably Colonel Beauregard, was walking toward them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. Mr. Rodriguez, Colonel Beauregard called out as Jake stepped out of his truck. I'm glad you decided to return. We have much to discuss. Jake studied the man who had threatened him over the phone just hours earlier. Beauregard was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent time in the military. His accent was distinctly Southern, and his manner suggested he considered himself to be in charge of the situation. Colonel Beauregard, I presume, Jake replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. You're trespassing on my property and preserving Confederate heritage, Beauregard corrected. This treasure belongs to the Confederate Memorial Trust, and we're here to claim it. Dr. Hawkins stepped forward, her professional credentials evident in her manner. Colonel, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins from the University of Nebraska. I'm here to inform you that this property and everything on it belongs to Mr. Rodriguez under Nebraska state law. You have no legal claim to anything found here. Beauregard's expression hardened. Dr. Hawkins, I'm afraid you don't understand the historical complexities of this situation. The Rodriguez family has been guardians of Confederate property for over a century. They were never the owners. That's not what the documents show, Dr. Thompson interjected, producing copies of the papers they had found with the treasure. These records indicate that Miguel Rodriguez purchased this property in good faith and became the legal owner of everything on it, including any treasure that might be buried here, Dr. Running Bear added. Beauregard examined the documents. With the eye of someone who had seen similar papers before, these documents are incomplete. The Confederate Memorial Trust has records that predate your discoveries by decades. Records that prove this cash was placed here under specific agreements that remain binding. What kind of agreements? Jake asked. Agreements that your great-great-grandfather Miguel signed in 1889. When he was recruited by Confederate agents to serve as a guardian of this treasure, Beauregard replied, agreements that bound him and his descendants to preserve the cash until it could be claimed by legitimate Confederate authorities. Jake felt his world shifting again. You're saying Miguel was a Confederate agent? I'm saying Miguel was a patriot who understood that the Civil War was about more than just slavery, Beauregard said. He understood that the South represented a way of life worth preserving, and he agreed to help preserve the resources that would someday restore that way of life. That's historically inaccurate, Dr. Running Bear said firmly. Miguel Rodriguez was a Mexican immigrant who had no connection to the Confederacy. He purchased this land to build a better life for his family. Dr. Running Bear, I'm afraid your understanding of history is limited by modern political correctness, Beauregard replied dismissively. The Confederate Memorial Trust has preserved the true history of this operation for over 150 years. Agent Chen's voice crackled over Jake's radio. Jake, I'm seeing movement in the cornfield. They're accelerating their excavation activities. I think they're trying to remove the treasure while we're talking. Jake looked toward the cornfield, where he could see Confederate Memorial Trust operatives working frantically to excavate the wagon and its contents. Colonel, I'm ordering you and your people to stop digging on my property immediately. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm afraid we can't do that, Beauregard replied. This treasure has been waiting for over a century to be returned to its rightful owners. We're not going to let modern property laws interfere with historical justice. Historical justice. Dr. Hawkins laughed. Colonel, you're talking about stealing treasure from a farmer who's trying to save his family's land. There's nothing just about that. Dr. Hawkins, you're thinking like a modern academic instead of a student of history, Beauregard replied. This treasure was never meant to be used for personal gain. It was meant to preserve Confederate heritage and values. Values like slavery and white supremacy? Dr. Running Bear asked pointedly. Beauregard's mask of civility slipped for a moment. Values like states' rights, individual liberty, and traditional American social order. Values that are under attack by people who want to rewrite history to suit their political agendas. Jake had heard enough. Colonel, I don't care about your politics or your version of history. This is my land. This is my treasure, and you're stealing it. I'm calling the sheriff's department, Mr. Rodriguez. I don't think you understand the full implications of this situation, Beauregard said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. The Confederate Memorial Trust has resources and connections that extend far beyond local law enforcement. If you continue to interfere with our operations, you might find yourself facing consequences that go well beyond the loss of your farm. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the realities of your situation. You're a small farmer with no political connections and limited resources. We're a national organization with members in government, law enforcement, and business. If you choose to fight us, you'll lose everything. Jake felt his anger reaching the boiling point. Colonel, my great-great-grandfather Miguel spent his life building something on this land. My family has worked this soil for 4 generations. I'm not going to let you destroy that legacy to fund your Confederate fantasies. Your family's legacy was built on a lie, Beauregard replied. Miguel Rodriguez was never a farmer. He was a Confederate agent who was paid to guard this treasure. Everything your family has accomplished was funded by Confederate gold. The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. That's not true. Dr. Thompson, show Mr. Rodriguez the documents we found in the wagon, Beauregard ordered. Dr. Thompson looked confused. Colonel, we haven't shared those documents with your organization. You haven't shared them, Beauregard? Said with a cold smile. But we've had copies for decades. The Confederate Memorial Trust has been monitoring this cache site since 1889. We know exactly what's in those documents, including the financial records that show how Miguel Rodriguez used Confederate gold to purchase this property. Jake felt his understanding of his family history crumbling once again. You're lying. I'm revealing the truth that your family has been hiding for over a century, Beauregard replied. Miguel Rodriguez didn't earn the money to buy this land through honest work. He was paid by Confederate agents to serve as a guardian, and he used that payment to purchase the property that would give him cover for his real activities. Dr. Hawkins stepped forward. Colonel, even if that's true, it doesn't change the legal ownership of the property. Miguel Rodriguez purchased this land in good faith, and that purchase is recognized by Nebraska state law. Dr. Hawkins, fraud invalidates contracts, Beauregard replied. If Miguel Rodriguez used stolen Confederate gold to purchase this property, then the entire transaction was illegal. You'd have to prove that in court, Dr. Running Bear pointed out. Which we're prepared to do, Beauregard said. But we'd prefer to resolve this situation amicably, Mr. Rodriguez. We're prepared to offer you fair compensation for your family's guardianship services. Enough money to pay off your debts and start over somewhere else. Jake looked at the Confederate Memorial Trust operatives who were still excavating his cornfield, at the expensive vehicles that suggested vast resources, at the man who was offering him money for something he claimed to own anyway. How much? He asked. $5 million, Beauregard replied. More than enough to solve your financial problems and provide for your family's future. The offer was staggering. $5 million would not only save the farm, but set up Jake's family for generations. It would eliminate all the financial stress that had been crushing him for years. Jake, don't listen to him, Maria said urgently. He's trying to buy you off with money that should be yours anyway. Maria, $5 million is more than we ever dreamed of, Jake replied. It would solve everything. It would solve your immediate financial problems, Dr. Hawkins corrected. But it would also validate the Confederate Memorial Trust's claim to the treasure. You'd be admitting that they have legitimate ownership, do they? Jake asked, looking around at the experts who had been advising him. Not legally, Agent Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Jake, I've been researching the Confederate Memorial Trust while you've been talking. They're a known hate group that's been linked to multiple domestic terrorism incidents. Taking their money would be like taking payment from the KKK. Comparison sent a chill through Jake. Colonel Agent Chen says your organization is connected to domestic terrorism. Agent Chen is a federal bureaucrat who sees domestic terrorism in any organization that doesn't conform to his political worldview, Beauregard replied dismissively. The Confederate Memorial Trust is a historical preservation society that has been protecting American heritage for over 150 years. By funding hate crimes and white supremacist activities, Dr. Running Bear added, Colonel, we know what your organization really is. Beauregard's civilized mask finally slipped completely. Dr. Running Bear, your people lost the Indian Wars, just like the South lost the Civil War. But unlike the South, the Indians have been given reservations and special privileges as compensation for their defeat. The Confederate Memorial Trust simply wants the same consideration for Confederate heritage. Confederate heritage based on slavery and racial oppression, Dr. Running Bear replied. Confederate heritage based on constitutional principles and traditional American values, Beauregard corrected. Values that built this country and made it great. Jake had heard enough. Colonel, I reject your offer. This treasure belongs to my family, and I'm not going to let you use it to fund hate groups. Mr. Rodriguez, I don't think you understand the consequences of that decision, Beauregard said, his voice turning cold. The Confederate Memorial Trust has been very patient with your family for over a century, but that patience has limits. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. Can't fight an organization with our resources and connections. If you continue to resist, you'll lose everything: your farm, your family's safety, and possibly your life. The explicit threat galvanized Jake's resolve. Colonel, my great-great-grandfather Miguel may have been involved with Confederate agents, but he chose to protect this treasure rather than turn it over to people like you. I'm going to honor his choice. Then you've made a grave mistake, Beauregard replied. Agent Chen's voice crackled urgently over the radio. "Jake, get away from Beauregard now. I've got movement from multiple directions. They're surrounding you." Jake looked around and saw Confederate Memorial Trust operatives emerging from positions around the farmhouse and barn. They were armed and moving with military precision, clearly preparing to take control of the situation by force. "Outrun," he said to Maria and the historians. "Get to the vehicles and get out of here." "We're not leaving you," Maria replied. "You're not going to have a choice," Jake said, seeing the operatives closing in. "Go now." Dr. Hawkins grabbed Jake's arm. "Jake, come with us. We'll fight this in court." "There won't be a court fight." "If they get the treasure," Jake replied. "Someone needs to make sure it doesn't fall into their hands." He broke away from the group and ran toward the cornfield, where the Confederate Memorial Trust operatives were still working to excavate the wagon and its contents. Behind him, he could hear shouts and the sound of vehicles starting as his allies escaped. Jake reached the excavation site just as the Confederate Memorial Trust operatives were preparing to load the treasure wagon onto a trailer. The sight of his family's legacy being stolen filled him with rage that overwhelmed his fear. "Stop," he shouted, grabbing a shovel from the excavation equipment. "That treasure belongs to my family." The nearest operative turned toward him, raising an automatic weapon. But before he could fire, the sound of sirens filled the air. Agent Chen's backup had finally arrived. "Federal agents," came a voice over a loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons and step away from the excavation site." The Confederate Memorial Trust operatives found themselves caught between Jake's desperate defense of his family's treasure and the approaching law enforcement officers. For a moment, the standoff hung in the balance. Then Colonel Beauregard's voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down.
All units.
Stand down." The operatives lowered their weapons, but they didn't move away from the treasure wagon. Beauregard approached Jake with his hands raised, showing that he was unarmed. "Mr. Rodriguez, this doesn't have to end in violence," he said. "We can still resolve this situation peacefully. By you leaving my property and never coming back," Jake replied, still holding the shovel defensively. "By recognizing that this treasure is bigger than both of us," Beauregard corrected. "Mr. Rodriguez, do you really think you can handle the responsibility of owning millions of dollars in Confederate gold? Do you think you can protect it from all the people who will want to claim it?" Jake looked around at the chaos that had erupted on his family's land. Federal agents, Confederate operatives, historians, and local law enforcement all converging on his cornfield. The simple life of farming that had sustained his family for 4 generations was gone forever. "I think I can do what Miguel did," he said finally. "I can protect it from people who would use it for evil. And what will you do with it?" Beauregard asked. Jake thought about his family's century of guardianship, about the responsibility that had been passed down without his knowledge, about the choice between saving his farm and preserving his integrity. "I'll make sure it's used for something." "Good," he said. "Something that honors the people who were hurt by the Confederacy, not the people who supported it." Agent Chen and his backup team had reached the excavation site, their weapons drawn but not aimed. "Colonel Beauregard, you and your people are under arrest for trespassing, attempted theft, and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism." "Agent Chen, I think you'll find that our legal position is stronger than you realize," Beauregard replied calmly. "The Confederate Memorial Trust has been preparing for this moment for over 150 years. We have lawyers, political connections, and resources that will make this case very expensive for the federal government. We also have evidence of your organization's involvement in hate crimes and domestic terrorism," Agent Chen replied. "I think that will outweigh your legal claims." As the Confederate Memorial Trust operatives were arrested and led away, Jake found himself standing alone beside the treasure wagon that had transformed his understanding of his family's history. The gold coins and bars that gleamed in the afternoon sun represented not just wealth, but the complex legacy of American conflict and the ongoing struggle between justice and oppression. Dr. Hawkins approached him carefully. "Jake, what do you want to do with the treasure?" Jake looked at the foreclosure notice in his pocket, at the farm that had been his family's home for 4 generations, at the cornfield where Confederate gold had been hidden for over a century. "I want to save my farm," he said. "But I also want to make sure this treasure is used for something good, something that heals rather than divides. What do you have in mind?" Jake thought about Miguel's century of guardianship, about the responsibility that had been passed down through his family, about the choice between personal gain and moral obligation. "I want to donate most of it to organizations that fight racism and promote civil rights," he said. "I want to keep enough to save the farm, but I want the rest to be used to repair the damage that the Confederacy caused." Dr. Running Bear smiled approvingly. "Jake, I think that's exactly what Miguel would have wanted. He protected this treasure for over a century, waiting for someone who would use it wisely. Will the Confederate Memorial Trust accept that decision?" "They'll fight it," Agent Chen said, "but they'll be fighting from prison cells. And they'll be fighting against the will of the legal owner of the property." Jake looked around at the farm that had seemed like such a burden just 48 hours ago. The failed corn harvest that had brought him to the brink of foreclosure had led to the discovery of one of America's greatest historical treasures. The land that had been his family's curse had been revealed as their greatest gift. "Agent Chen, how long will it take to settle the legal issues?" "Months, probably. But Jake, there are institutions that can provide bridge financing while the legal issues are resolved. You don't have to lose the farm while we sort this out." Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The foreclosure deadline that had seemed so urgent just hours ago was no longer a threat. The treasure that had been hidden beneath his cornfield for over 150 years had finally revealed its true purpose, not to fund Confederate restoration, but to provide the resources for healing and justice. "What about the Confederate Memorial Trust?" he asked. "Will they keep trying to claim the treasure?" "They'll keep trying," Dr. Hawkins replied, "but they'll be fighting against documented legal ownership, federal law enforcement, and public opinion." "Jake, you've not only saved your farm, you've dealt a major blow to one of the most dangerous hate groups in America." As the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, Jake stood in the cornfield where his great-great-grandfather Miguel had first planted crops over a century ago. The land that had seemed like a burden had been revealed as a sacred trust. And Jake had proven himself worthy of the responsibility that had been passed down through 4 generations. The Confederate gold that had been hidden beneath his family's farm was about to be transformed from a symbol of oppression into a force for justice. The failing farm that had seemed destined for foreclosure was about to become a symbol of the ongoing struggle between hatred and healing in American society. Jake Rodriguez, reluctant guardian of dangerous knowledge, had discovered that some inheritances come with the power to change the world. The treasure that could have funded hate would instead fund hope. And the farm that had been saved would become a reminder that some legacies are too important to abandon, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The Civil War had ended over 150 years ago, but the battle for American justice continued. And in a cornfield in Nebraska, that battle had been won by a farmer who understood that some treasures are worth fighting for, not because of their gold, content, but because of their power to heal the wounds of history. Epilogue. 6 months later, Jake Rodriguez stood in the same cornfield where he had discovered the Confederate treasure. But everything had changed. The land that had been scheduled for foreclosure was now the site of the Miguel Rodriguez Center for Civil Rights Education, funded by the sale of Confederate gold to the Smithsonian Institution. The treasure had been authenticated at $12.7 million, making it one of the most valuable Civil War discoveries in American history. Jake had kept enough to pay off his debts and secure his family's future, while donating the remainder to organizations fighting racism and promoting education about the true history of the Civil War. The Confederate Memorial Trust had been largely dismantled by federal investigations, their leaders imprisoned for conspiracy and domestic terrorism. Colonel Beauregard had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His organization's century-long campaign to claim Confederate treasure finally ended. "Miguel would be proud," Maria said, joining Jake in the field where winter wheat was now growing in neat rows. "Protected this treasure for over a century, and you found a way to use it for good." Jake looked across the fields that had been his family's burden and were now their gift to the future. The failing farm that had seemed like a curse had been revealed as a blessing. And the Confederate gold that had been hidden beneath his cornfield had been transformed from a symbol of oppression into a force for justice. The treasure hunt that had begun with a desperate attempt to save. His family's land had ended with the preservation of both his farm and his integrity. And Jake Rodriguez, guardian of dangerous knowledge, had discovered that some inheritances come with the power to heal the wounds of history and build a better future for all Americans. The Civil War was finally over, and America was finally free to heal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.